As Conan the Barbarian once said, what is best in life is to see your enemies crushed, driven before you, and to hear the lamentations of their women. And I think articles like this, after years of progress on gender, the male gaze is back, counters lamentation from sort of 2014 to 2024 girl boss feminism. When they're writing articles like this, they realize they're on the cultural outs. So this is by author Madeline Holcomb, and she says, "This summer I got cultural whiplash. As a child of the 90s and early 2000s, I grew up with my grandmother and mother's generation's fight for legal and workplace equality helping shed social misogyny." What she's saying is, my forebears have been driving relentlessly towards equality via the use of state power to liquidate differences between men and women, to demand that you don't notice any differences in culture, and to artificially generate opportunities for women, regardless of their actual usefulness in the economy, to create equal outcomes between men and women. What she's saying is, we wanted gender parity, and now nature has reared its ugly head, our pitchfork has become blunt, and people seem actually a lot happier living in a state of ambiguous complementarity between the sexes and reverting to their natural type than living according to my ideological fiction. And she truly is living in a fiction, because she says, in the past decade in particular, I saw the evidence of progress in my media diet. The movies, shows, books, and advertisements I consumed were increasingly giving women a seat at the table. Heroin chic fell away and body positivity entered the fashion world. Pause there for a second. The implication that men were running the fashion world, rather than gay men inflicting their standards on women, according to what a gay man thinks a woman would look like, aka being more masculine or androgynous and therefore more attractive, or women were running the fashion industry and inflicting female covert competition standards on other women, is laughable. I mean, go back to, there's a great EV magazine piece about women's magazines in the 60s and 70s, the sorts of stuff that would be of the ethic of Helen Gurley Brown's Sex and the Single Girl, that said, ladies, you can have it all, you can sleep around in your 20s right through to your mid-30s, you can be, what's her name, Cary Grant from Sex and the City, and have strings of illustrious affairs, and then you can get married and settle down and have kids if you want them. You can freeze your eggs, you can have a high-powered career, you can accept no limitations from nature, culture, or expectations from men, and have everything you want. And according to a recent spate of films like, what's the new Bridget Jones one, Mad About the Boy, and that weird series that was inspired by Harry Styles fan fiction featuring Anne Hathaway, if you hit your late 40s and 50s in the middle of your menopause and you get a sexual second wind, well, you can leave your husband and your family behind and go out and ensnare yourself a 20-year-old boy toy and have lots of hookups to your heart's content. These fictions sold to women are damaging. They have ruined many lives. And they've been sold to women by women. Often, if you look at the likes of Simone de Beauvoir, by childless grotesques who want to push an ideological revolution driving towards genderless communism. But the downstream effects of that are women being sold the fiction that situationships will be fulfilling and that you don't need to have children in order to have a life that means anything to you. We'll continue. She writes, stories about a woman stealing your man were traded for celebration of the girl's girl who resisted the competition for men's attention. Okay, again, it is a total fiction. It is saying that there is a sisterhood, there is solidarity between women, and that your primary biological drive, which is to meet someone with compatible genetics and reproduce, no longer matters. Instead, we can all live in some sort of hippie commune where a lysinkoist loyalty to your gender matters more than finding the best possible spouse to spend the rest of your life with, to have and raise children with, and to hold your hand when you die. The idea that that was ever going to be a subordinate concern to sitting in a floodlit office, filling out spreadsheets, and then going for brunch with the girlies was always demented. And the reason you feel the need to write this article is because you've been sold that lie, but you don't know how to back out of that particular cul-de-sac. Now, fortunately, this writer is actually far less entrenched in the sunk cost fallacy than lots of women will be at this point, because she says her husband and her got married earlier this year, so okay, they're already having a revealed preference for traditional lifestyles, despite pushing forward feminist ideology, which means this entire piece actually kind of codes as a female covert competition strategy, but nevertheless. She says, our vision of what our life could be included wide-ranging possibilities, influenced in part by the movies and shows we grew up with. We saw, read, and listened to stories of involved fathers, successful mothers, and well-matched partners who supported one another. Now, that's not untrue historically. In fact, this is something that Mary Harrington has made a point of before in interviews with me and some of her articles for Unheard. The 1950s vision of a man who goes out to a job outside the home and is the breadwinner, commutes to and from the office, comes back, and the woman is purely confined to the household without a job and just dedicated to cleaning, cooking, and raising the children, is a post-war American aberration. It might be aspirational, it might be desirable to be, Homer Simpson, who is a single income earner, considered stupid but owns a detached house, supports 3 kids, has 2 pets and 2 cars on that one income. That might be a desirable vision of the future, but it hasn't existed for very long. Instead, men and women always work together in ambiguous complementarity, doing different jobs that were sex-specific, much closer to the home, and the children of each sex would be the apprentice of either their mother or their father. So your job would basically be your dad's job. If you were the son of a blacksmith, you would grow up being trained as a blacksmith. Your dad would work near the home and he would be present a lot of the time. And so, actually, the way that the modern information economy and market works has actually pried fathers away from the home, made women vulnerable to the predations of feminist ideology, then convinced women they needed to go away from the home, which has meant that either institutional childcare raises your children, or the market devours so much of your personal life that neither men or women are coupling up, or if they are, they aren't having children in the first place. So there is a point here of saying there needs to be a greater honesty about the historical involvement that both parents had in their children's lives, and both were involved in producing goods for the household economy. But it wasn't for the market, it wasn't for individual empowerment, it wasn't for the ideology of absolute equality. It was working in solidarity to provide for the family, in direct proximity to your children and to your home. The economy stems from the oikos, the home. Instead, what she's describing is getting her entire worldview from Captain Marvel. So, no wonder she doesn't understand this reversion to at least what was closer to historical type. She says, then there was a shift. Was it around the 2024 presidential election, or since the overturn of Roe v. Wade? Maybe when men's rights activists push back against Me Too. What you're seeing is a retracing of the dominoes here. Back all the way to the SJW cringe compilations and even 90s political correctness. What this trend demonstrates is that people are sick to the back teeth of biological denialism by feminists that has been going on, well, we can say since Mary Wollstonecraft, but has been put on steroids ever since the 1990s. She says, whatever the catalyst, a change in the political environment seemed to connect with a social change that brought back narrow and at times constrictive ideas of womanhood depicted in media. Yes, rooted in biology that aren't determined by a fringe sliver of the population who devote their entire lives to egalitarian activism, and is instead dictated by market demand from women who have healthy relationships with men. This is why the likes of Pirates of the Caribbean is the ultimate female fantasy. It's Elizabeth Swann being, yes, capable, but also dependent on the men around her for protection against evil monsters, and both men, despite being opposite ends of the spectrum, the sort of dashing gallant knight in Orlando Bloom's Will Turner, or the scoundrel with a heart of gold in Johnny Depp's Jack Sparrow, are both vying for her affections. She is the object of competent men's desire. And that earned absolute billions at the box office. Same with Disney princesses. They often, Mulan aside, are the object of the prince and his endeavours as a gallant hero against whatever evil monster that they're fighting against, be Maleficent or the Queen in Snow White or whatever. Essentially, women want to be the prize of the best possible man's labours. And that's not a degrading thing. That's a a desire that we should respect, and that men should fashion themselves into responsible, competent agents in order to meet that expectation. But that's only if you have a healthy understanding of men and women as the prerequisite to a healthy relationship, a healthy marriage, and the ability to have and raise children. Instead, if you're high on egalitarian ideology, you can't recognize those differences, and so the re-emergence of those differences is an affront to your ideology, and you think it's the sort of hidden hand of capitalist oppression or something. She says, the recent rise of weight loss medications coincided with social media influencers sharing ways to get smaller and no longer celebrating bodies of all sizes. Yeah, morbid obesity isn't a good thing, turns out. It's not just lethal to your life expectancy, it's hideously ugly and a sign of the indulgence of vice and a deficit of virtue. And considering we're undergoing civilizational hardship, virtue, courage, prudence, temperance, and the like are all required. It's not very Homeric to be 400 pounds like Lizzo. How have these discarded ideas made their way back into circulation? Didn't we all agree we were through them? Nope. No, we were all existing under the yoke of woke political correctness and censorship, and you were, in a very feminine fashion, long-housing us into staying quiet and putting up with your absurd delusions lest we lose our career, our livelihood, our mortgage, and our ability to provide for our family. So you were actually emotionally blackmailing and bullying us into not speaking out when you said this grotesquely fat and emotionally entitled woman is actually a generational talent. And it turns out that when one guy stood up and said, no, I think she's actually an embarrassment and not to be lauded and emulated, and we shouldn't just celebrate people for their ethno-narcissism or their obesity, turns out that that was actually the majority opinion, and so a lot of other people have stood up and made their voices heard too. And you're now looking around wondering where all your co-belligerents went. You were always in the minority. You were just being astroturfed in this historical anachronism of mass delusion. She says, the culprit, I have learned, is the male gaze. It was always there, but now it has stepped back into the spotlight. And she goes on about Sydney Sweeney's American Eagle campaign, which of course they compared to Nazism, but it turns out that blonde women with large breasts, especially those who are not entitled and who seem kind of earnest and approachable and don't have a vindictive and pathological hatred of men for being men, turns out that they have mass market appeal to the sensible normal people who don't hate the other sex for virtue of having different genitalia and blame them for oppression since the dawn of time. Like, the feminist concept of patriarchy is actually hilarious, because either it's some grand conspiracy that is present in all times, all places, and all cultures, somehow transcends languages, happened at exactly the same time, despite not having telecommunications, or it's rooted in biology. And that's actually the more honest approach, which is why feminism led to transgenderism and ended up in the same place as Maoism did from communism, which is declaring war on nature itself, because it poses constraints on the will and prevents equality. So this is just a declaration of war on nature. But, yet again, sharpen your pitchfork all you like, nature's going to come back. She writes, the male gaze includes stories about women in relation to a male character, think wife, daughter, victim, and media in which the camera angles and visual storytelling make the audience feel they are viewing the women from a heterosexual male's perspective. And this is according to some banal academic who gets cited for articles like this. But this is correct for both men and for women. Because for men, the esteem granted to them by women is earned by a noble endeavor, a great sacrifice, the undertaking of great responsibility, proving himself to himself and her through some great and difficult labor. And so, for women to be the object of those affections is itself desirable. This is why female romance novels have some monster or billionaire or surgeon be transfixed with otherwise a mediocre woman in whom they see some great and hidden beauty. They read themselves into these texts because most women are just average. Now, there's usually a man that will find them to be beautiful and charming and want to spend the rest of his life with them. That's not an insult to them. But most women are not going to be picked up in a helicopter by a billionaire vampire surgeon. what they want is for a man with such high status to find himself incapable of controlling his urges around her. Because she is so desirable, so beautiful, and it validates all of her beliefs about herself or suppresses her anxieties about being inadequate. Because lots of women do worry about not being good enough. Harrison Pitt, my friend and Deprogram co-host, has this great framing where he says women exist on a continuum of either too frivolous or too earnest. And both his missus and my wife are definitely on the too earnest end of the spectrum. They're constantly worried about not being good enough for other people or their emotions putting upon the people they love in their lives some sort of burden that we don't want to handle. Instead, much like the great labour men undertake to win the affections of that woman, to be a continual rock upon which her emotional waves break is both reassuring and a fulfilling duty for the man to do. And so, the man is the doer, and often, in these stories, and in real life, the woman is the nurse who tends to his metaphorical or sometimes literal wounds when he goes out to battle to defend her and all that they hold dear. So, the idea that the male gaze, as defined here, does not appeal to women is absurd. What you're trying to do instead is insist that women who like being women and like being protected and provided for by the men who love them are labouring under some sort of false consciousness which is anathema to equality, and they should actually prioritise the ideological pursuit of equality over their organic desires and interests and their healthy relationships with men. And this is why you kind of rubbing your nose up against reality is just taking your skin off rather than making progress through the brick wall of nature. This is why you're expressing such confusion in this article, and you're blaming the male gaze, some sort of ideological conspiracy, for the organic and expressed desires of both men and women resurging themselves. And I know you probably expected the gender polarization gap to manifest much worse than it actually did in the 2024 presidential election, but it turns out that women who love men for being men actually outnumber demented feminist harridans who want to drive towards genderless communism. Sorry, that's just how it works. So she also writes, take the Bechdel test. Coined by cartoonist and graphic novelist Alison Bechdel in a comic strip, to pass it, a book, film, or show must have at least two women. They must talk to each other and about something other than a man. Failing the test is a good sign that media is part of the male gaze. You can probably think of plenty that can't check any of those boxes. The issue she has again, and this is something that was even observed by Simone de Beauvoir in a very resentful fashion in The Second Sex, is that men are object-oriented and women are often subject-oriented. Women are more relational than men are. And so, the Bechdel test tries to prescribe the way that women actually relate to one another. Often, conversations between women are delightfully incomprehensible to men. This is something that was actually observed by Caitlin Moran in her patronising book What About Men, where she said the solution to the disparity between how men and women communicate is men need to open up about their feelings more, because men communicate with other men by trading information. And there's a bond of mutual consideration there, because if by imparting information off onto you, I think this will be of use to you, practically, and it will spare you some form of suffering that someone else has undergone by not knowing the information, or it will bring you some form of success that otherwise, if you were ignorant of that information, you wouldn't have achieved. So this is considerate between men. Sharing information is an acknowledgement of mutual respect, that you're engaging on that shared labour, that you reap the rewards of either proving yourself to yourself or earning your place in a hierarchy, a broader social network, a wife and children. Whereas between women, often they talk about, bodily processes is a big one, which I don't understand, but their relationships with one another or the men in their lives. And so, by the Bechdel test saying you can't discuss your relationships with men, all it does is it puts women down the narrow cul-de-sac of either defining themselves as economic consuming and producing units, which makes them atomized individuals, incapable of enmeshing themselves in those social relationships, which then create families and marriages and children and the sort of wholesome, happy lifestyle that lots of people actually want, or it puts them in that network of feminist solidarity from which the 60s and 70s feminist networks sprang from. I'm thinking of Carol Hanish's essay, The Personal is Political, where she explains that originally feminist activism spawned from female therapy circles, where they agonized over whether or not discussing their feelings was sufficient political activism. And actually, this is where the phrase The Personal is Political came from, because they said by sharing their sense of emotional turmoil, their frustration with the patriarchy, they were raising their consciousness as women among women, and fomenting that resentment that then translated into revolutionary energy. And this is why the solution in the Barbie movie, which was accidentally right-wing, to the imposition of patriarchy, aka where the Kens took ownership of their lives rather than being a slave class, a standing reserve of emotional validation to the girl boss Barbies, and in the Kendom, women were actually pretty happy being exclusively paired up to one of their Kens who finally got a job and made something of his life. The solution to that was to have the weird Barbie, the lesbian Barbie, who was disfigured and wearing Birkenstocks, shove loads of Barbies into the back of a van and subject them to feminist brainwashing to break their brains, and then go and cheat on the Kens. So these sort of feminist solidarity circles, where you dislocate yourself from the enmeshed social networks that make life meaningful, that give you obligations to worthy dependents like a husband who loves you and kids who adore you, things like the Bechdel test only make it possible for women to be feminists. And so if this woman has only consumed recent media, which has been written through the filter of the Bechdel test, which just seeks to affirm the emotions of resentful women as women at odds with men, it's no wonder that she thinks the male gaze is responsible for everything, and that nature reasserting itself is a form of oppression. She goes down, and it says, historically, and she's quoting Dr. Catherine Strell here, who's a lecturer of marketing at some Chicago School of Business. And, sorry, but any time an academic says, I'm an academic in business, well, clearly you're not a very good businessman, because otherwise you'd be out running a very profitable business rather than telling people how to run a business, so you should always be skeptical of that. But she says, historically speaking, there's almost always a backlash after women have achieved something. More recently, women started going to college at higher rates than men, the gender pay gap started to close, women started having children later, LGBT rights made strides, and body positivity pressed companies to diversify depictions of beautiful people. But those trends were followed by the recent retro popularity of trad wives and a resurgence of thinspiration, skinny legends, and what I eat in a day videos that revived a restrictive beauty ideal on social media. I don't know what this woman looks like, but either, well, I have a pretty good idea, she resembles Tess Holliday, or she is, again, engaging in female covert competition strategies to convince the women that are taken in by the male gaze argument to make themselves as fat, pierced, tattooed, and ugly as possible to take themselves out of the dating pool. Many such cases. But notice the premises here. Women going to college at higher rates than men, so competing with men explicitly on zero-sum terms. The gender pay gap starting to close. Same thing. Women having children later, and LGBTQ rights, the ever-expanding acronym of self-definition to consolidate the gains of the sexual revolution. And body positivity, aka encouraging people to be as fat and gluttonous as possible, all constitute positive progress. This is despite women's self-reported happiness declining since the advent of feminism. This is despite women having fewer mating and dating options because they have more qualifications than men, and women want to date across and up in terms of economic and education hierarchies, whereas men date across and down most of the time. And, of course, a number of women subjected to the false premise that you can change sex or be no sex at all, and therefore have surgically and medically altered themselves and robbed themselves of the ability to have children, as well as robbing themselves of healthy sexual function, causing osteoporosis, causing cancer and early death. All of these things are apparently positive progress, even though they don't bring women happiness, and they don't bring women closer to the goal of having the families that in many surveys they say they want. So what is the goal being driven at here? If not women's happiness. The goal of feminism is the complete dislocation of women from social networks to make you a free and self-defining autonomous individual, and equal outcomes. This is basically the promise of both liberalism and communism made in the Enlightenment, that originally we all existed in a kind of Garden of Eden, we were all blank slates, we were all totally free and totally equal, a direct quote from John Locke, And it was only the first man who picked up a rock and declared it to be his that introduced inequality and tore the sexes, the races, the classes asunder. This is Rousseau's vision, this is Marx's vision, and it's this false anthropology which feminists have seized upon to engender resentment between the sexes, break families apart, and prevent men and women from coupling up as is normal to them, having healthy relationships, having the families they want, and living fulfilling lives. And it's usually total freaks on the margins of society like Jean-Paul Sartre, or Simone de Beauvoir, or Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx, who have pushed this stuff to the detriment of people who imbibe this ideology downstream through media products like this woman who's written this article, who bases her entire worldview on what she watches on Netflix, and the insidious messages contained therein that she clearly doesn't have the critical eye to examine. So under this section here, she notes that various forces have converged on the feminist message. For example, Harrison Butker, speaking at a college commencement last year, telling women they'd been told lies about the need to go out and work in the corporate world and abort their children, and instead that they can stay home and be homemakers and mothers if they wish. And of course, she lavishes scorn on the manosphere, with its sole avatar being Andrew Tate, despite manosphere discussions predating the pimp-turned-imam in question. She says, however, those voices are being met with other perspectives. Men advocating that sharing the mental load of running a household is part of being in a family, or that protecting and providing includes supporting your wife and caring for the emotional well-being of those you love. Men can be good, strong listeners and be of service to their family, they say. Men who can take care of themselves, think laundry and cooking, aren't just good adults, they may be more attractive to women, the counter-messages say. Now, unfortunately for her, this does run contrary to evolutionary psychology, because it turns out that men who do more housework around the house actually get less sex overall. Turns out women just aren't attracted to that. But I want to decode some of this paragraph, because what's actually been written here isn't really objectionable. To say that caring for the emotional well-being of those you love is a good thing? Yes, obviously. To say that you need to be capable of laundry and cooking of your own accord? Yes, obviously. You should keep a clean house. You should have a schedule. You should be personally responsible. But the reason she's saying this is either to prime the constituents of a household, of a marriage, of a family, as being, yet again, self-actualized individual units who just come together out of rational consent and therefore can dissolve that bond on the grounds of rational consent, which is why no-fault divorce has seen a rise, which is why people don't see the logic of coupling up and subordinating themselves to a marriage contract, because we're just individuals and we should have a golden parachute to pull anytime we wish if it makes more economic sense or increases our level of freedom. And the idea is that here, any dependency on one another should be stigmatized, which means that marriage is basically impossible under this individualistic framework. And when she says caring for the emotional well-being of those you love, she doesn't mean challenging delusions. She just means affirming every tenet of feminist ideology and having essentially a live-in manservant, like a Ken, saying just how hard women have it, and being a self-effacing man that, frankly, most women aren't attracted to. Most women want a winner. They want a man who is capable of leading not just other men, but his household, because they find him most attractive. And I think I can speak with some authority on this, considering I'm pretty happily married these days. So, the idea that women want a man who is a manservant, who is more preoccupied with doing his share of the laundry than he is with taking care of her and being emotionally continent so that she can express her anxieties and have them soothed with a, it's going to be fine, don't worry, dear. Yeah, that's just a total lie. Also, the other point about this, the expectation that men will also do their lion's share of economic productivity and do the housework is an unfair expectation. You hear a lot about this unpaid labour premise that is used to say that, well, women being housewives and stay-at-home mothers is just economic exploitation because they aren't paid for their labour. Sorry, but if they're not going out to work, and they shouldn't have to, I think more single-income households would be much better for children. If they aren't going out to work, how's the mortgage getting paid? How are the bills getting paid? Oh, that's right, it's because their lifestyle is being subsidised by their husband's work, who is making substantial sacrifices to support the lifestyle. And unless he's spending it all on snacks and Xbox, well, that sacrifice is noble, and he wants to do it. He wants to go to work and give up his income to take care of his wife and kids because he loves them. It's not a form of economic exploitation or depriving her in some sadistic fashion of her individual autonomy. It's a sacrifice he is making to make sure that those he loves are comfortable and taken care of. And that in a relationship which recognizes the healthy differences between men and women isn't a bad thing, but it is pathologized by someone who thinks the male gaze is to blame for literally everything. She says, women sometimes turn the male gaze on one another. It happens when they objectify themselves, promote traditional gender roles as the ideal way of living, and enforce beauty standards for others. Rattle says, this academic who has absolutely no credibility. So reminder, ladies, if you want a healthy, happy marriage, if you don't want to commute into a soulless office in a dangerous city every day, if you would rather be taken care of by a man who is earning his money and giving it to you so you can have a comfortable and albeit pampered lifestyle, remember, you are perpetuating oppression, you're labouring under a false consciousness, and instead, you should be aiming for absolute individualism and equality, earning your own money and going back to an empty apartment, save a couple of cats in the evening. Does it sound like an enticing vision to you? No? Well, it must be the male gaze. I couldn't possibly fathom why this version of girlboss feminism isn't selling to women anymore, who recognise the diminishing returns of being a single income earner without any kids, renting for the rest of their life and giving away their most fertile and productive years to a soulless corporation that will replace them without so much as a golden watch on the way out. And then she writes about media yet again. Women have made strides when it comes to representation in media. Take Reese Witherspoon's production company championing women-led stories and films, and Selma director Ava DuVernay's critical and box office success. Note, Ava DuVernay is a demented race activist, and she couldn't get her act together to get New Gods produced, so that production fell through. So, judging by the all-female corporations and production shoots that have gone on, well, hasn't always ended spectacularly. Also, wasn't Reese Witherspoon recently accused of paying writers complete pittances for the rights to their films and then making loads of money off of it? Not exactly great solidarity with the sisterhood there, is it? She then writes, but film and television has historically been dominated by male writers and directors. The efforts of female storytellers have been largely a push against the status quo, and often the lens under which the works are viewed represent a dominantly male perspective. Yes, because if men are object-oriented, then the plot tracks a sort of traditional three-act structure where, the hero has the call to adventure, he encounters the villain, he stumbles at some great trial and tribulation, he then is privy to some kind of hidden knowledge or support from an accessory character, either a wise old king or an unexpected sort of wizard figure, a sort of Yoda wise master in a guise that you wouldn't quite associate with wisdom or courage or strength, or he receives some sort of support from his love interest and he plucks up the courage and strength to face down the villain. He restores order to the kingdom and he is rewarded handsomely with wealth, power, status, and the affections of a good woman for his endeavours. Instead, female-centric narratives, dislocated from that natural hierarchy, focus entirely on women sharing their feelings, and it just sort of goes in a circle. Again, think Captain Marvel. Captain Marvel did not undergo any heroic trial. She always had the power inside her, and it was just the oppressive patriarchy telling her that she didn't, that she ought to smile more, that she ought to control her emotions, and actually it was the authentic expression of her emotions, just letting all her rage out, which allowed her to be a hero. So she was always a hero, and the narrative is just about confirming to herself that she is a hero. She is a self-generative narcissist, and this is what the female-centric feminist narratives want to depict. And it turns out that isn't very appealing to men, or the women that quite happily love men and want to be in healthy relationships with them. And so, we'll just finish here, where she says, in a world where male loneliness is a crisis, the isolation problem gets even worse when the culture tells men that women, about half the population, offer beauty, sex, and running a household and are not viable options for real emotional connection and partnership. As a man, you should not be deriving your emotional sustenance from your wife. What I mean by this is, yet again, you should be the rock upon which her emotional waves break, and you should not be troubling her with problems that you can take care of yourself. Yes, of course, if there's grief in the family, if there's an illness, if there is a problem which will implicate her, tell her about it, but don't go blubbing in front of your wife. Don't go blubbing in front of your bros. They should be bullying you into having some strength and composure there. Instead, men need networks of other men in order to be good men. Women have to understand that there need to be male spaces where men can be men apart from women, and that They do not need to express their emotions in order to be good men. In fact, often expressing their emotions in ways that women express their emotions makes men much weaker and therefore less attractive to and less capable for protecting, providing for women. And so, women shouldn't listen to this. This is terrible advice from a woman whose own marriage may well be intact, but we can't evaluate its success. And instead, ladies, if you do want to have a healthy, happy marriage, if you want a good relationship with the men in your lives, if you would like to build a functioning, thriving civilization where men protect and provide for you, and you can act as the cultural custodian of that which men have built and impart it onto the next generation, don't listen to total bollocks about the male gaze. And insofar as the male gaze exists, enjoy your time in it.